Welcome to the first section of the course. And in this section, you're going to learn the very basics of the JavaScript language. Things like variables, data types, functions, objects, arrays, and many other things that are part of the JavaScript language. And the best part is that you're actually not just going to learn JavaScript itself, but at the same time, the fundamentals of programming in general. Now, later in the course, we're actually going to come back to many of these fundamentals, but for now, I just want you to get a quick overview of how the language works and get your hands dirty with some coding. So this part of the course is really not about making things look pretty in a browser or anything like that. Right now, we just want to focus on the JavaScript language itself, and then the rest will come later. All right, so let's go start this journey right now. Let's now actually write our very first line of JavaScript code. And here I am in my text editor brackets that we just set up in the last lecture. And I hope that you already downloaded the starter files from the course. I already have them here on my desktop. So it's in this folder here. And you see that here I have the index.html file. Okay. And so going back to the brackets text editor, all we have to do in order to start a new project is to hit this button here and then click open folder. And so the folder that I want as my project folder is this one here. Okay. And so now all I have to do is to hit open. And so this is now the project folder, and it opened here this this index.html file. So you see that this is here just a very bare bones HTML structure without any JavaScript in it at this point. Okay. And so let's now actually add some. Now there are two ways in which we can add JavaScript to a website. And the first way is with inline scripts. And the second one is to add an external JavaScript file in which we can then add all of our JavaScript code. And let's start with the inline script. Okay, so all we have to do is to write script. Give it some space. And then in here, we can write our very first line of JavaScript. And what we're going to do now is to simply print to the JavaScript developer console some text. Okay, and so all we have to do is to write console .log and then some text. And we will write hello world. And this is kind of a standard text that we print out whenever we are learning a new language or like starting a new app or something like that. Okay, so hello world, you will see this here all the time when you search for tutorials on the web or something. Okay, and then to finish the line, we always have to add a semicolon like this. And so that is our very first line of JavaScript code here. So nothing really fancy. All it does is to log to the developer console this hello world text. Okay, then we give it a save and open it up in the browser. I have installed a brackets plugin to automatically save the file whenever I leave the app, and that's called autosave. And so I don't always have to save the file manually. Okay, so I'm gonna leave now here and then open up this folder, double click the file, and then it's going to open it right in the browser. So on the left side in our code editor, we write our code, of course, and then in the browser on the right side, we will have our results. And to actually see these results, we have to open up our JavaScript developer console. And you can do that by hitting Command Option J or Control Option J on your keyboard as a shortcut like this. Or you can also right click, hit Inspect, and then come to the console like this. And here you see that we already have our hello world printed to the developer console. And you see on this side here that it comes from index.html on line 13. So exactly this line that we have here. So great, it works. So again, nothing really fancy here. All we do is to log some text to the console. And that's what we're going to do here throughout the section. So we're going to log some text all the time to the console because we're not really doing anything here in the browser itself. So no real website, because that's something that we're going to take care of later. For now, we are just really learning the JavaScript language, and so logging some values here to the developer console is perfect for that kind of application. Okay, so this is how we do inline scripts here. Now let's learn how to add an external script to our site. Okay, so first off, of course, we create a new file, and I'm calling it script.js. Okay. And now let's actually add the same code here. So console.log and then hello world again. And now I'm using 3 of these exclamation marks here just so that it's a different kind of text here than before. Okay. then back in our index.html file, we can now, of course, delete this code here. We leave the script because we still need it, but now what we do is to define the source attribute. So we write source and then script.js. Okay, and so now our script file and our HTML file are linked through this. Now, if the script was like in another folder, like for example called JavaScript or JS, then we would have to write like js/script.js, but that is not the case here, and so let's get rid of that. And so that's already all we have to do to add an external script to our website like this. So let's come back here, reload, and now we have hello world again, but with our 3 exclamation points, and then you also see that it comes from script.js on line 1 now. And so that's exactly this text that we have here. Okay, and from now on, we will use this script.js file here because it's always best to have the code in an external file. So the advantage of the inline script that we had before is that we don't have to load an additional file, but it's still better to have everything in an external file because it allows us to nicely keep the HTML and the JavaScript separated in different files. Okay, and so that's what we're going to do throughout the rest of the course. Okay, and that's already it for this lecture. So you learned the difference between inline and external scripts, and you wrote your very first line of JavaScript where we logged this text here to the console. And with that being said, let's now move on together to the next lecture where you will learn what JavaScript actually is. So see you there in a second. So you already coded a line or two of JavaScript, but what exactly is JavaScript actually? Well, that's what we're going to look at in this video. And so in this lecture, we will set the stage for the rest of the course. And so it's really important that you follow this one until the end. All right? So per definition, JavaScript is a lightweight, cross-platform, object-oriented computer programming language. Now that sounds a bit too much, right? But don't worry, it's simpler than what it sounds like. So lightweight just means that the language doesn't eat up much memory of the computer and that it has a relatively simple syntax and features. Cross-platform means that the language can be used on multiple platforms and systems, not just for web development. And finally, object-oriented means that it's a language that's based on objects. And we're going to explore all of that throughout the course. Now, as you already know, together with HTML and CSS, JavaScript is one of the 3 core technologies of web development. And more on that in a second. So for web development, JavaScript has traditionally only been used in the browser environment, which means that it was only a client-side language. However, more lately, thanks to a new technology called Node.js, developers are now able to actually use JavaScript on the server side as well. But that is a whole big topic for itself, and we will not cover that in this course. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this course covers the JavaScript language itself and how to use it in the browser, which is the more traditional way. Okay? So in summary, JavaScript is what made modern web development possible. It allows us to not only add dynamic effects and interactivity to more simple websites, but it also allows us to develop complex modern web applications that we can interact with and that almost feel like the apps that we can use on our computers and phones every single day. Now, something else that I think is important to mention here is that today there are lots of JavaScript libraries and frameworks out there that implement different architectures and help developers build complex apps more easily and faster than ever. So I'm talking about stuff like React or Angular or even jQuery, which are all extremely popular, and I'm sure that you have heard of them already, right? Now the thing is, they are all 100% based on JavaScript, and so before using them, developers actually need to be really good at JavaScript. They need to be really able to understand the language itself, and that's exactly where this course wants to help you. So I mentioned that together with HTML and CSS, JavaScript is one of the core technologies of the web, and so let's go a bit deeper into that and talk about the role of JavaScript in web development. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all work together to create beautiful, interactive, and dynamic websites or web applications. Now, the HTML is responsible for the content of the page. So the text, the images, the buttons, and all the content that you see on a web page is always written in HTML. Then the CSS, of course, is responsible for the presentation of that content. So basically for styling and for laying out the elements on the web page. And then finally, JavaScript is the real programming language that allows developers to add dynamics into the picture, like interactive effects, manipulation of the content or of the CSS, and much, much more. So again, HTML is responsible for the content, CSS for the presentation, and JavaScript for adding real programming capabilities to websites. Now, another way to easily visualize the role of each technology is to put them in terms of nouns, adjectives, and verbs. So in this thought experiments, HTML does the nouns like saying that the P element is a paragraph. So paragraph here is the noun. The CSS then is the adjective because it describes the noun, like saying the paragraph text is red. And so there is the adjective. And then finally, JavaScript is the verb, like saying hide the paragraph. And so we are doing something here, and so we have a verb. Okay, does that make sense? And so that is the role of JavaScript in web development. And now just before we finish, I want to quickly mention that there are different versions of the JavaScript language. But I'm not going to go into that right now, and instead I'll leave that for the end of this section, okay? For now, I just want you to start coding as fast as possible. And so we're going to use a version called ES5 over the next couple of lectures. But again, at the end of this section, there's a whole very important video about this. In this video, you will learn about the fundamental concept of variables. So variables are a fundamental concept of every programming language in the world. But what actually is a variable? Well, we can say that a variable is like a container in which we can store a value in order to use it over and over again in our code, instead of having to write the value each time that we want to use it. Okay? So let's actually get rid of this code here. And so let me show you how to declare a variable for the very first time. So we have to use the var keyword and then the name of the variable. And I'm going to call this one first name, then equal, and then the value that we want to assign to the variable. And in this case, what I want to assign is a text, a string called John. Okay, and then again, our semicolon at the end. And so with this, we just declared our very first variable. So the variable name here is first name, and the value that we assigned to that variable is John. So you can basically think of this variable, this first name variable here, as a piece of memory in your computer in which this John string here is stored. So I used these quotes here to declare this text here, so this string, okay? I could also have used the double quotes like this, but I think it's a bit more modern to simply use these single quotes. All right, so when we declare some text, we usually just use the single quotes just like this here. All right, so throughout this section here, I will be using variables about persons for all the examples. So stuff like names or jobs or age or something like that. So something defined persons. So let's now do again a console.log. And what we're going to log now is simply the first name variable. All right. And so what do you think will happen when we reload our page now? So let's take a look at that. And indeed, you see John now logged to our console. And that's because we assigned John to this variable. And then JavaScript can retrieve the value of this variable here, which we declared as John. And so first name here is effectively the same as John. Okay, does that make sense? Let's now declare another one. And again, we have to use var. And now let's say last name equal, then again I use these quotes, and then let's say that it's Smith. So John Smith. So that's the last name, and let's declare another one called age, and so let's say that John is 28 years old. And so you see that now it's no longer a string like we had here, but it's now a number. And so that means that it's a different data type. Okay, so here we have text, but here we have numbers. Okay, and so now this is a good time to actually talk about different data types in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, there are 5 different data types: number, string, boolean, undefined, and null. And so far, we have already seen the number and the string, right? Now, primitive data type just means that it's not for objects, unlike most things in JavaScript. So they are just simple, primitive, non-object data types. So first off, we have numbers again, and JavaScript numbers are always floating point numbers, which simply means that they always have decimals, even if we sometimes don't see or even don't define them. So for example, 5 is like having 5.0, all right? And in other programming languages, many times it doesn't work like this, and you have different data types for integers and decimals, but not in JavaScript. So here all numbers are simply float numbers, even if they look like integers. Next up, we have strings, which are simply a sequence of characters, and so they are just used for text, like we did in the example before with the last name and the first name. Next up, the Boolean data type is a logical data type that can only take one of the logical values, true or false. So to make it simple, a Boolean is always either true or false. Okay? And we will see why this is very important over the next lectures. Alright, and the next one is a bit more difficult to understand. So basically, undefined is the data type that is automatically assigned to a variable that doesn't have a value yet. Sounds a bit more complicated than it actually is, and don't worry, I'm going to show it to you a bit later, of course. But what matters here for now is that basically undefined means non-existent. Alright? And finally, there is another data type which is quite similar to undefined, and that is null. So null also means non-existent, but it's slightly more specific. And again, we will take more about these two later on. Now, before we move on, there's something very important to note here, which is that JavaScript has a feature called dynamic typing. And this means that we do not have to manually define the data type of a variable, unlike in many other programming languages. So basically, JavaScript automatically figures out if a variable is a string or a number, or if it's undefined or a Boolean, and then assigns that data type to the variable without us having to do anything. Okay? And if we then later assign another value to the same variable, but with another data type, then JavaScript will automatically change the data type of the variable as well. So this can of course be very useful and save us some coding time, but it can also be the source of some difficult to find bugs, which means errors in our code. Okay? So we always have to be careful with what we do with our variables. Alright, and that's it. So let's now actually see these things in action again and move back to our code. So to show you the Boolean data type, let's create a variable here called full age. So var full age, and then say true. And remember that Booleans can only be true or false, and so in here we can simply say true or false. Okay, so I could of course also have written false, but in this case, well, John is of course of full age with his 28 age. And so let's now take a look at the console when we log this variable here. So full age, the semicolon, and then reload it. And now you see here that it's true. Okay, so it also appears in a slightly different color here. This one is blue, and the John string here is black. All right, so here it also looks a bit different. So it's of course not in quotes. We simply write out true like this because it's a reserved JavaScript keyword. Okay, now before we move on in this lecture, I want to quickly talk about these variable names here. Okay, so it's a best practice in always giving our variables meaningful names. Instead of simply writing something like X or ABC or something like that, we should never do that. We should always say in our variables what we actually want, okay, or what this variable actually means. So in this case here we have John, and that's a first name, and so we call this variable first name and not just some random sequence of characters. Okay, and the same of course for last name, age, and full age. And so again, that's a best practice. Of course, it would work the same if we say A, for example, and then A here. If we now log it to the console, then of course John is still here. But again, we want our variable names here to really have some meaning. Then this way of writing the variable name with this first word here and then the name, where I separated them with a capital letter here, that's the so-called camel case notation. Okay, so we could have done it like this. So first name all together, but then it would be kind of difficult to find where the second word starts. We could also have done it like with an underscore, but in JavaScript, it's kind of a convention to use the camel case notation like this. Okay, so we start with a small letter in the beginning, and then when we have a second word, then that one starts with a capital letter. In the case of age here, for example, that's not the case because we only have one word. But then here again, in full age, we have the second word here with this capital A. All right. So that's not about the JavaScript functionality itself, that's more of a programming convention and a best practice. Okay, moving on, let's define yet another one, and this one I'm going to call job. Now the difference here is that I'm not going to assign anything to this variable. Okay, so I can declare a variable but not assign a value to it. And so let's see what happens when we now take a look at this variable. And can you guess what's going to happen here? I hope you can. And indeed, what we see here is now undefined coming from script.js at line 11. So this line here prints undefined to the console. And remember that when I showed you that slide, I mentioned that undefined means not existent. And so that's the case. So we declared the variable, but we didn't assign any value to it. And so therefore job is simply undefined. And so that's what we see in the console. We can then later go ahead and assign something to it. So let's say job is teacher. And if we do the console log then again, and let's just copy it here, well, then we should see the teacher. And here we go. So from line 14 comes the teacher after we have declared it here in this line above. Okay? So we have strings here, we have numbers, we have a boolean, and we have also the undefined right here. And so these four are the most important data types that I wanted to show you. Now, just to finish off this lecture very quickly, I want to show you some rules that we have to keep in mind when we name our variables. So I already talked about the best practices when naming them, so with this camel case notation that I explained before, but that was not really a rule, that was more of a best practice. But actually there are also some rules that we have to keep in mind. But don't worry, they're actually very simple. All you have to know is that variables cannot start with numbers or symbols except for the $sign or an underscore. Okay, so let's try to break some of these rules to see what happens. So var, and now I'm going to start a variable with a 3, so with a number. So let's try to say 3 years equals 3, and then reload the console. And now you see that we get an error here in line 16. And so this is here not valid. And again, because we cannot start a variable name with a number. All right, so I'm showing you this that in case you start naming your own variables, you don't run into these errors and then cannot figure out what this here means. So always take care and use these rules that I'm showing you here. Now, if we wanted to fix this here, we would either have to start with a number or with a $sign or an underscore. Okay, so these are the only symbols that can appear in a variable name here in JavaScript. So for example, with the underscore, it would work just fine. With the $sign as well. But as soon as I start putting something else like this, well, then again, we get the error here, okay? And the same actually happens if I use a symbol in the middle of a variable name. So something like John/Mark, for example, John and Mark, and you will see that this here is not going to work again. Okay, so we have an error here at line 17 now, of course, but I want the error now on line 18, so let's take a look at that. And of course, it says unexpected token, which is this one. So in this case, we would of course use the camel case notation here to make it a lot better. And so now we don't have any error here anymore. So that was the first rule, that again, all variable names must start with either an underscore, a $sign, or a letter here. And then the second and last rule is that we cannot use reserved JavaScript keywords as variable names. So something like function, for example, is not going to work. So function equals 23, for example, and this will not really work. So you see unexpected token function. We can also not use something like delete, which is also a reserved keyword. And you will meet many of these keywords here throughout the course, of course. But right now, just know that any of these keywords that we're going to use later, something like if, for example, you will not be able to use these as variable names. So variable names really need to be our own made up words and not the words that JavaScript already uses in its language. And all right, that's actually all there is to know about the fundamentals of variables and data types. So that's already a huge step forward and a very important concept in any programming language of the world. In the next video, we're going to dive a bit deeper into variables and do some more stuff with them. So stay tuned for that next video. Welcome back. In this video, you're going to learn how to mutate variables and also how and why JavaScript does type coercion. But before we talk about any of that, I want to show you something else that we also have in any programming language in the world, and that is comments. So with comments, we can really comment like pieces of code and describe what they do. Okay, so let's try it out. And in JavaScript, there are two types of comments. There are single line comments, and we work them just like this, and then also multi-line comments. And I'm going to show you in a second how they work. But with single lines, we simply write // like this, and then we can do any text that we want after that. So in here, I'm simply going to write that these are the variable naming rules, okay? Because that's actually what I did here in these lines of code. So I showed you how we have to name our variables. And so now with this comment here, I can very simply describe that this is what we did here. Okay, we can also do a multi-line comment, and that is /*, and then asterisk and / again. And then on multiple lines. And everything that we put here in between will be a comment. So one line of comments, two lines, and so on and so forth. Okay, and here I'm going to use this multi-line comment to say that this lecture here was about variables and data types. So variables and data types, and this is also a common like pattern where you then add some asterisk here, just like this, basically just to separate these lectures. Okay, so variables and data types, that was the last lecture, and now in this lecture we will have variable mutation and type coercion. All right. Now, just in order to get rid of this code here so that it doesn't get in my way, I can also comment out this entire piece of code, just like I did before. So that's another common use case of comments, is where you basically comment out some code that you don't want to get in your way for some time. Okay, and so now I commented it, and now it will no longer be executed. So I can reload this now, and then we don't have anything logged to our console because all of this here is gray, and so it's really commented out. Okay. Anyway, let's continue with our person's example here and learn all about variable mutation and type coercion. Okay, so I'm going to reuse some of these variables. So first name is still John, and let's also define the age as being 28 again. So we have here two different data types, string and number. But let's see what happens if we want to print them together to the console. Okay. So let's give it some space here. I prefer when this text here is a bit more at the top. So console.log. And so let's basically do a string which contains John space 28. Okay, so we can say first name, then we can use the plus symbol, and I'm going to explain you later that this is an operator. So for now, let's just simply use this here to join these strings. Then we can do a space, and then another plus to add the age. Okay, so we are hoping that this here will then become John space 28 to the console. Okay, so let's check that out. And indeed, we have John 28. So how did this work? Because remember that age here is actually a number and not really a string, but still it logged it here as a string in this entire John 28 string. And so this works thanks to something called type coercion. Okay? So what this means is that JavaScript automatically converts types from one another as it's needed. And in this specific case, it converted this number here to a string in order to be able to join these three strings. So John is a string, then this space here is also a string, and then age, the number, will automatically be converted by JavaScript also into a string so that it can then join all of these strings into one bigger string. And so automatically JavaScript does this work for us here by a process called type coercion. And other programming languages are not like this. We would have to convert our variables, but JavaScript is easier. It takes all that work away from us and does it automatically. And joining strings like this here is just one of many examples of type coercion that we will encounter throughout the course. So type coercion here happens all the time in JavaScript. All right, let's now try out another example here with joining strings. And so let's create some more variables. So job, and now I'm going to show you something different, which is basically to declare many variables on the same line and then define them later on. So job, to say John's job, and then we can also define a variable called isMarried. So basically like a marriage status saying true or false, whether he is married or not. And now we can say job is teacher, and then that is married is false. Okay, so we declared both of these variables here, and they are then undefined, remember? So that's what we had here. So I declared the variable here, job in this case, and it was then undefined, remember? And only later in this line here, I then assigned a value to that variable. And so that's the exact same thing that we do here. So here we declare multiple variables on the same line, then I assign the values to them here in these different lines. Okay, and so that's also actually like a common practice. In case that we want to declare many variables, it's a bit cleaner to do it like this, all in one line, and then simply assign them the values a bit later. Now what happens if we want to log to the console a variable that has a boolean here included? So let's try it out with console.log, first name, and then let's say, so John is and then the age here, year old, and then finally the job. And if we then want to include the boolean that we defined before, well, then we can also, like, let's say, is he married? So we kind of ask a question here, and then let's see what happens when we try to join the is married variable here into the string. Okay, so that looks a bit confusing here, but what should happen here is John is a 28-year-old teacher. Is he married? False. So let's take a look at that. And we get this error here. And that's just because I was missing this plus sign here. Let's try it again. And so John is a 28-year-old teacher. Is he married? False. And so you see that even the boolean here gets converted to a string. So JavaScript also does type coercion with booleans. And if we now actually take away this variable here, and so I'm commenting it out here, well, let's see, then it should say undefined. Okay, so even the undefined is coerced into a string, so basically converted into a string. Okay, let's take a look again, and so now it says false. All right, so this is type coercion, and now again I can write a comment here saying what we did in this particular section here. Okay, and now let's actually look at the variable mutation. So variable mutation basically means to change the value of a variable. And so that's something that we didn't do up until this point, but of course that's something that we can do with JavaScript variables. And so let's now redefine the age. So we can say age equals 28, for example. And so this time we don't use the var keyword. So this part is not necessary because the variable was already defined before. It's already declared here in this place with the var keyword. And so when we want to change it, we no longer need the var keyword. So always say is age and then the new value. And in this case here, it is 28 as a string this time. And so as I explained to you in the last lecture, JavaScript automatically figures out the data type and can change it on the fly. So before it was a number and now it is new and it's a string. So that is the magic of the JavaScript dynamic typing. Okay, we can also of course change something else. Let's change the job here. So job, and let's say driver. All right, and so let's now log it again to the console. Or instead of logging, I want to show you something else. So we've been logging these values to the console all the time, but now I want to use alert. So let me show you what alert is going to do. And it's this beautiful window here. So we get a pop-up window basically. So John is a 28-year-old driver. Is he married? False. Okay, and so this time it's not in the console, but instead it is like this small pop-up or alert window. And you see that basically the page here keeps loading until we actually hit OK here and make this pop-up disappear. So the page is loading. It's not really, it cannot really finish its work until we hit OK on this. Okay, so we did some variable mutation here and type coercion. We also observed, I showed you the alert, which is an alternative to console.log. Let me just show you something else here, which is that we can actually, in an easy way, get data from the user with a similar method that alert. So we can use prompt and then basically ask a question here. So let's say, what is his last name? Okay, so we say prompt, what is his last name? And we will then be able to input a value. And that value we can then store into a variable. So var last name. So that's what we're asking for here. And then we can log it to the console just to make sure that everything works. So last name, and we can also add the first name here. Okay, so that's the pop-up from before, so this alert here. And now here comes the prompt. Okay, so what is his last name? And let's say Smith. And now this will be stored into the last name variable, and then we can log this variable to the console. So first name plus the last name will of course give John Smith. So Smith is what we just defined. If we now say like Miller, then it will log John Miller. Okay, so that's our input coming from that window. Great, you're progressing at a great level here and already learned a lot of JavaScript. Of course, there's tons more to come, and so let's quickly move on to the next lecture where we're going to talk about some basic operators. So like doing math operators and compare different values with one another. So stay tuned and see you in a second. Let's now learn about a couple of basic JavaScript operators. So here I already created like the title for this lecture and also commented out the code here of the last lecture. Okay, so we could actually do this here in different files, like one file for each lecture, but I prefer to just keep it everything simple here, all in one file. Now for operators, they can be, for example, the simple math operators that we already know, like plus and minus and times. And then beside that, in JavaScript, we have a couple of other operators that I'm also going to show you. So in simple terms, operators are like functions that are written in a special way in JavaScript. And in case you're wondering what functions are, don't worry, again, we will talk about this a bit later. But for now, let's actually take a look at some math operators and how we can use them in JavaScript. So let's calculate in what year John was born, and that's very simple. So let's call it year John. And so we have 2018, which is the current year, minus John's age, right? And remember we used to declare it as 28, and so let's use the same here. And so now we can then log it to the console. So let's take a look at that. And indeed, 1990. Okay, so this here, the minus is a math operator in JavaScript. And let's now do the same for, let's say, for someone else, like John's friend. Let's say he's called Mark. And so 2018 minus 33. So Mark is 33 years old. And now you see that we are starting to repeat some of the values. So for example, 2018 here, we are using it multiple times. And so let's declare it as a separate variable. So that is what variables are for. Okay, so we can say var year is 2018. And so now instead of having to reuse this 2018 here, we can then write year in these two places. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And of course, it still displays the exact same number. But if we wanted to change the year now, let's say to 2020, well, then we wouldn't have to change it here in these two places like we had before. So before, if we wanted to change the year, we would have to change it both here and here. And that's something that we always want to avoid in programming. And so we define this year in one place, and then it gets used in these two places here. Okay, and actually let's also declare all of these variables here in the same line like I showed you before. So year, then year John, and year Mark. Okay, and then remove these vars from here. So this just looks a bit better. So that is just the minus operator here. But of course we can do all kinds of math here. So for example, we can multiplications. So let's say we wanted to add 2 years here. And so now it's not defined. So this is of course not now, but it's year. Well, actually this should be called now because now is the current year. So 2018. So what we want here is this to be called now, and also here and here. All right. And so let's take a look at what happens then. And indeed, it logs 2020 to the console, which is 2018 plus 2, right? Of course, we can also multiply. So let's say now times 2. and we can of course also divide. So let's divide by 10 here. All right, logging it all to the console. Well, then of course we see that this is 2018 times 2, and this is 2018 here divided by 10, and so we end up with this like decimal number here. Okay, so these are the math operators that we used here. So let's add a comment here saying that. And now I'm going to show you some logical operators. So let's write that down here as well. And so let's say that we want to compare the age of Mark and John and figure out if, for example, John is older than Mark. And so for that we can use a logical operator. So first of all, let's actually define these ages here as different variables. So age John is 28, and then age Mark is 33. And so of course here we use age John and then down here age Mark. So let's create a new variable here called var John older, and then we will say age John greater than age Mark. Okay, and then of course we need to log it to the console here to see our result. And so let's take a look at what happens now. And we see our result is this boolean and it's false. Okay, and so what this means is that age John, which is 28 here, is of course less than age Mark, which is 33. And so basically here we ask the question, is age John greater than age Mark? And the result of that is false. Okay, and so our John older variable here turns out to be false. Now if it was the other way around, if we asked age John less than age Mark, well, then it should be the other way around. And so yeah, indeed it is now true. Again, because age Mark is 33, which is more than 28. And so we have a way now of basically creating a Boolean variable using one of the logical operators that I just showed you. And there are many more that we're going to explore a bit later in the course, and actually in this section in a couple of videos. So math operators here are pretty straightforward. Then these logical operators, which are also very important, as you're going to see later throughout the course. And then before we leave, I also want to show you the type of operator. Okay, and this operator is a bit different than the other ones. So the one that we used up until this point always required like two things to compare or to add or to multiply. So now times 2, or now divided by 10, or age John less than age Mark. So we always had two operands, but with the type of operator we only have one. So let me show it to you. And so let's log to the console the result of using the type of operator on, let's say, the John older variable. Okay, and so basically what this will do is to tell us the type of this variable. And so indeed we get Boolean, and that's because obviously this is a Boolean variable. So we saw that here as it returned this true. And as you learned in one of the last lectures, a true or false value is always a Boolean, right? Remember that? So let's try it out with some other stuff here. So type of, and let's now say age John, and this should be a number. And indeed it is. Let's actually copy this now. And let's try it out with a string, and we don't have any here. So let's just write it ourselves. Mark is older than John, for example. And then also let's try something else. So let's just declare a random variable here and not define it. And then let's log to the console the type of this. And so what do you expect that the type of X will be? So let's test it. And I hope you know that it will be undefined. Okay, so that makes sense, because indeed we did not define any value for the X variable. And the one before here, of course, is a string. So this may not seem like a big deal to you here, this operator, but actually you will see that we will use this here in the future, and actually also later in this section. Okay, so this is the very basics of JavaScript operators. Now in the last lecture, we will keep working with operators, where I'm going to show you some more, let's say, advanced stuff. So don't wait and come with me right to the next video. Hey there! In this lecture, we will continue talking about operators and operator precedence. So for this example, let's say that we want to calculate if John is of full age only based on the year in which he was born. So let's first declare a couple of variables. So now is 2018. The year John was born was 1989. And then we also define the full age variable. And that's the age at which you officially become of full age. So in most of Europe, that's 18. Maybe in the US, it's 21. I'm not sure, but let's use 18 here for this example. Okay, and so what we can do is to calculate the age and then compare it with 18 here. And we're missing the equal sign, of course. And so what I want to do is to do all of that calculation all in one line. Okay, so var is full age and then equal now minus year John, and that will calculate the age. And then we want to test if it's greater or equal to the full age. Okay, so does that make sense? So let's take a look at this and try to figure out why this works. So you see that we have actually two operators. We have the minus and then this logical greater or equal operator all in one line. So all in here. Now, how does JavaScript know which operator actually to execute first? Because imagine that first this here would be executed. So we would ask if year John is greater or equal of full age, which would return a true or false value. And then we would do now minus this true or false value. And so this would be nothing significant. So this would not be what we want. Instead, what we want is for this year to be executed first. So now minus the year of John. And then we want to compare that age with the full age. So this here works, and let's actually test that. And I'm going to show you why in a second. Okay, so this actually returns true. And of course, John is of full age. So in 2018, born in 1989, he is 29. And so of course, he is of full age. Now, in order to figure out why this works here, we have to think about operator precedence, which means which operator is executed first. And so if you come here to my resources page at codingheroes.io/resources, down here in the JavaScript section, you will find this operator precedence. Okay, so let's open up that link. And then down here, we have the operator precedence table. And so what we see here is that the operators that are here on the top of the list will be executed before the others. So you see that the one with the highest precedence is using this grouping here with the parentheses. And I'm going to show you that in a second. But what we're interested in here is our plus, or actually our minus operator, which is this one, and our logical operator greater or equal. So this one here. And so what we can see from this table is that the minus operator has a precedence of 16. Okay, so that's what this value here is the precedence value, which is greater than the one from the greater or equal operator, which is only 11. And so what that means is that this minus here will be executed first. And so all of this is executed first, and then we end up with the result here. So in this case, it will be 29. And then only after that, 29 will be compared with the full age with this operator, which has a lower precedence with only 11. Okay? And so after that, we end up with the result, which in this case here will be false. So let's actually write that here. Or actually, it is true. And so right now we have var is full age equals true. And what I want to show you next is that the equal operator itself, and where is it? Ah, here it is. So the assignment operator, as it's called, is also an operator itself. And I mentioned that to you in one of the last lectures, and now it makes sense. Okay, so you see that this equal operator is the one with the lowest, or almost one of the lowest, precedence. And that makes total sense, because of course we want the assignment to happen as the last step. So after all the other operators have done its work, in this case or minus and or equal or greater than operator, they are all have done their work now, and we end up with the true result. And so as a final step, it is then assigned to the isFullAge variable. All right, does that make sense? So actually we not only have two operators, but we have three. The first one that gets executed is this one, then this one, and finally the assignment operator. All right. And whenever we need to know if something works, the order in which our operators work, you can always just consult this table here, which is why I put it here right on my resources page under the JavaScript section. All right, so let's now look at another example where we want to calculate the average age of John and his friend. So let's say age John, because we haven't really calculated it. We only calculated it here. So let's actually grab this here. So now minus the year John, and then the age of Mark. And let's just say it's 35 without any calculations here. And so the average will be to basically calculate the sum and then divide it by 2. So age John plus age Mark divided by 2. But this is not really correct, right? And you know that from your math classes that you had in school probably. And so you know that this dividing operator here will have precedence over the plus, okay? And so let's confirm that in JavaScript it also works like that. And you can see that right here. So the division here has a higher precedence of 14 than the addition of 13. And actually when we talked about this example here, I mistakenly used this operator here, which is the unary plus, but I meant this one here, so this addition operator. But of course it still has a higher precedence than the greater, okay? So it doesn't really matter using this here or the unary plus operator, okay? It's a different operator, but in terms of precedence, the addition is still higher than this logical operator, okay? Anyway, what we need to do here is to group this here together with parentheses, just like again, you learned in your math class probably. And so that makes sense because we see up here that with the highest precedence, we have the grouping, okay? And so that's using parentheses. And so if we do this, well, then this operation here has the highest precedence. So first we add up the age of John and Mark, and only then we can divide it by 2 in order to create the average age. So let's just take a look at it in the console, just to make sure that everything's working correctly. And so indeed, it is 32. And that's because, and let's quickly do it here in the console, 35 plus 29 is 64, and 64 divided by 2 is of course 32. So this calculation here is correct. Let's just add some comments here. So this is with multiple operators. Then here we have grouping. And now let's do some more examples with grouping and multiple assignments. So let's say that we have a value that we want to assign to multiple variables at the same time. And that's totally possible in JavaScript. And so let's create 2 variables, x and y. And so right now I'm not really creating variables with a meaningful name here, but that's no problem. This is just for doing some mathematical operations, okay? And so let's just start by saying x equals, and just some math operations here, let's say 3 plus 5, and then times 4 minus 6, okay? So just something like this. And so we already know which will have precedence here, right? So the grouping has precedence, and this will then turn out to be 8. And so let's actually write it down here. So after the first step, we have 8 times 4 minus 6. Then the next step will be this multiplication here, right? So 8 times 4 is 32 minus 6. And finally, this will then turn out to be 26, okay? So x will be 26, and let's log that to the console, just to make sure. And indeed, here it is. So 26 is the result of this calculation. And so, as before, it did all of these operations, and only then it did the assignment. Now, if we wanted to assign this to x and y at the same time, we could very simply do x equals y, and then equals this entire calculations here. Now, the question here is why this actually works. Imagine that we're reading this line here, and we see x is equal to y. And so at this point, y is still undefined, right? Because we didn't define any value for it before this line. And so it would be kind of logical that x would be undefined at this point, but it is not. Let's take a look at that actually. And this is something that we didn't do before, which is to log 2 things at the same time. So we can say console log and then x and then a comma and then another variable. And so we see 26 and 26. So 2 results at the same time with the console.log. And so what we see here is that 26 is not undefined, which would be logical So again, because y is undefined at this point, and if we say x equal to something that is undefined, well then x should also be undefined, but it's not. And so let's take a look at why that happens, and I can show it to you here in the table again. So we have the precedence here that we already talked before, but we also have the associativity. And what this simply means is the direction in which the operation is executed. So if we come down here to, for example, the multiplication or the addition, we have left to right. Okay, and so all that means is that, for example, if we had, let's add it as a comment, if we had 2 plus 4 plus 5, then it would do it from the left side to the right side. So first the 2 plus 4, which is 6, and then 6 plus 5 to 11. But there are some operators that work the other way around, so which are right from left. And the assignment operator is one of them. So here we have assignment, and assignment works from right to left. Okay, so that's the other way around. And so that is why this piece of code here actually works, because we end up with the result here of 26, and then the assignment works from right to left. So it doesn't start by doing x equal y, but instead it starts by saying y equal 26, and only then it does x equals 26. Okay, does that make sense? So again, the assignment operator works not from the left to the right, but from the right to the left. And so here we end up with a result of 26, and then that is assigned to y, and then that again in turn is assigned to x. And so therefore we end up with 26 in both these variables. Okay, so that is the associativity. That's the second part of the table that I wanted to show you. So we don't just have to keep precedence in mind, but also the associativity. All right, and now just to finish this lecture, I just want to show you some more operators. So let's say that we wanted to double x. So something like x equals x times 2, right? So that would be the double of x. But you see that we're actually repeating the x here. Okay, and so in JavaScript, there's a way of making this a bit more simple, which is simply saying x multiply equal 2. Okay, and so this is the exact same thing. So what this means is that basically it will do x times 2 without us to having to write out that x times here like we did here. Okay, so let's take a look at the result. And so 52 is indeed 26 times 2, which was x before. And the same thing would work for plus, minus, or multiply. So we can say x plus equal 10. And so what do you think this will turn out to be? And I hope that you guessed 62, right? So that is 52, which is the result from before, plus 10. So it's the exact same thing as writing x equals x plus 10. All right? So that makes our lives a bit easier. And these operators, you have them down here in the assignment section, because they are actually assignment operators, just like the normal assignment operator. Okay, and now just the last one that I want to show you is the increment. So what we can do instead of writing x equals x plus 1 would be to write it like this. So we could do x plus equals 1, but there's an even simpler way if we only want to add 1. And that is to simply write x plus plus. And so this operator simply adds 1 unit to the variable that we're using this operator on, okay? So this is all the same thing here, but of course this one is the easiest to write and the most handy one. So just to prove you that it actually works, let's log this one to the console as well. And so it's of course 63. And the same way it works with minus minus. And so right now it should be 61. And yeah, indeed it is. So that was a lot to take in up until this point. You learned all about variables, data types, and also operators. So I hope that it's all making sense to you, that you're having some fun. And so next up, there's coming a coding challenge where you can put all of these new skills to practice in a fun and small challenge that I have for you in the next video. Welcome to your first coding challenge in this course. And so this is the challenge that I want you to take. So Mark and John are trying to compare their body mass indexes, which is calculated by dividing the mass by the squared height. Okay, so this formula here. And to calculate the square of a number, you simply have to multiply it by itself. And so the final formula becomes mass divided by height times height. Okay, and here note that the height must be in meters and the mass in kilograms. All right, now the first step that you have to complete is to store Mark's and John's mass and heights in different variables. Okay, so just like we've been doing all this time up until this point. Then next up, calculate both their BMIs, then create a Boolean variable containing information about whether Mark has a higher BMI than John, and so that again we did before. And then finally you can print a string to the console saying something like, is Mark's BMI higher than John's? And then the Boolean that you created or that you calculated in step 3. Okay, so true or false. And so this is again very similar to something that we did before, and so this should be not a big problem to you, hopefully. Now if you find some problem here, if you cannot really solve it, then it's absolutely no problem here, okay? So don't beat yourself up if you're not able to 100% complete this. So everyone has different learning speeds and learning styles, and so it's really okay if you're not able to do it 100% on your own here, okay? So if you need to look up something that we did before, that's not a big deal, but you should really try to remember the stuff that we did before and use that to solve this challenge, okay? Anyway, the solution to this is in the next video where I'm going to show you how I would calculate this. So good luck with this, and see you in the video after you complete this coding challenge. So here goes my solution to the coding challenge. We start by defining the variables. So var mass Mark equals, let's say 78, and you could use any numbers that you wanted here, so I didn't define what the masses and heights were. Just remember that they have to be in kilogram. Let's give us some more space here. So we have mass Mark, then we have height Mark. Let's say 169 meters. So not really tall. Okay, and we could declare all of these variables here in one line, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to declare them one after the other. So Mark and now John, 92 kilograms, and then the height. And so that's step number 1, I think. Now next step, calculate both their BMIs. And so BMI Mark is Mark's mass divided by the square of his height. So height Mark times height Mark again. And then body mass index John. So mass John divided by height John times height John. So that was step number 2. And now we want to create a Boolean to determine if Mark has a higher BMI than John. So var Mark higher BMI. And so all we have to do is BMI Mark greater than BMI John. So that should be our Boolean variable, and now we can log it to the console. So is Mark's, and now we cannot just write a quotation mark to write Mark's, okay, because then that would be outside of the string. So this marks the beginning of the string and this the end of the string, but we still want to have the symbol here to say Mark's. And so what we have to do is to escape this quotation mark, and we do that by adding this backslash. Okay, so that is called escaping, and that's something really common in programming as well. So is Mark's BMI higher than John's? And now again we need to escape and then close that string. So we have our string, is Mark's BMI higher than John's? Actually we want to ask a question, and then we say plus, and now you know that is an operator, and so we basically add strings together, and then Mark higher BMI, which should whether be true or false. So let's load it. And so is Mark's BMI higher than John's? And it says true. And let's actually also log these two BMIs to the console, just so that we're sure if everything's working correct. So console.log, and remember that we can actually log two values to the console at the same time, simply by adding the comma here. Okay, so Mark and John. And so we see that the first one is 27, so Mark is 27 and John is 24. And so Mark's BMI higher than John's, and of course, yeah, it's true, because of course this here will return true. So it will give us the result of true, which will be assigned to Mark higher BMI. Okay, so that's the solution to the challenge. Of course, you could have done it differently as long as the solution is the same. So in programming, many times, there's not just one correct solution. There are many ways to solve the same problem, okay? And that's something very important that you should know and that you should keep in mind always when you're programming. So there's not one correct way to solve a problem. There are always many ways. And so if you solve this in a different way, which is still correct, then it's absolutely valid. And it's great that you found a different way of solving this from my way. And so, yeah, let's now move on to the next video. Welcome back to the next lecture, and this is a very important one because in this one we're going to start taking decisions using code. So JavaScript, as well as most other programming languages out there, has a couple of control structures, which are features that allow us to execute only certain parts of our code or to execute parts multiple times. And the first control structure that we will talk about is the if-else statement, which is a conditional which basically allows us to take decisions using code. Okay, so let me show you how that works. And first, let's bring back some of our variables. So let's say first name is again John. And now let's create a variable that we didn't use before, which is for the civil status. So civil status. And so this one basically says if you're married or single or divorced or something like that. And so let's just say that John is a single. Okay, so he's not married. Now what we want to do here is to log a string to the console whether he is married or not. Okay, and for that we can use an if-else statement to take decisions. So we write if, and then we open parentheses, and then in here we have to write a logical condition. So something that returns a Boolean true or false value. So that's something like we did before. So for example, this one here. So this will return a true or false value. And so it's a perfect logic condition. Okay, now in this case, we don't want a greater or a smaller comparison like the one that I showed you, but instead we want an equality operator. So basically what we want to do is to test if the civil status is married. So let me show you how to do that. So we can say civil status equals married. Okay, and so this condition here will return true if the civil status is married and false if it's not. Okay, so this here again is like a logical operator which returns true or false. There's also the version with just two equals, but let's talk about that one a bit later. Okay, so again, this here will test whether the civil status is married or not. And then we open curly braces, and then this here is the block, so the if block. And in here we can now write our instructions basically. So in this case, our console.log. And what we want to log to the console is first name is married. So if the civil status is married, then this text here will be logged to the console. And if not, well, then nothing happens. So let's reload it. And indeed, nothing happens. And that's because right now, this here turns out to be false, right? Because the civil status is actually single and not married. And so this is different. And so when we have false, well, then this piece of code is not executed. Let's change it here to married for a second, just to see if it's working just fine. And it is. So now it says John is married because the civil status is the exact same thing as married here. All right. Anyway, let's change it back to single because now I want to show you the else part of the if-else statement. So we can have only the if part, but we can also add an else statement. So we can say else, and then we have the else block here. And so what this does is that if this is not true here, so if it's false, well, then it will execute the else block, okay? So let's test that out. will hopefully marry soon, okay? And so that of course means that he is not married at this point. So let's test it, and let's keep in mind that here it says single. And so this part here will not be executed because this here is false. And that means that we're gonna jump right to the else block, and so this text here should be logged to the console. Check it out, and yeah, it works. So John will hopefully marry soon. Now let's say that we actually have a Boolean variable already. So we can have a variable called isMarried. And let's set it to false, and let's then test what happens in that case. So instead of this test here, we could put isMarried, and then we could put equals true. But that part is actually not really necessary, right? Because what we need here in this condition is a true or false value. But this isMarried variable is already a Boolean. So right now it is set to false, but we could also set it to true. So let's do that. And so again, what we want here is a true false value, but isMarried is already true. So it is already a Boolean. And so this part is not even necessary. Okay, does that make sense? So here we just need a true false value again. So no need to write the true. Let's test that. And now it says John is married here, coming from line 173. So this one here. Of course, this one here is still coming from this if-else statement from before, where we say that the civil status is single and not married. But this is just another example where I wanted to show you that it's actually enough to pass a true or false value here into this condition. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, that you now learned how we can make decisions using code. And of course we could do much more difficult and much more complex stuff into these blocks, the if block or the else block. All right, now just to finish this lecture, let's bring back the code from our coding challenge that we coded up before, and let's basically write something better to the console. Okay, so what we did here is to simply log this string here and then together with this true false value. So that's not really the best solution, right? To just print true false to the console. So now that you know the if else statement, we can do a lot better than this, right? So what we can do instead of all of this, let's comment it out actually, is to write if BMI Mark is greater than BMI John. Well, in this case, we want to print something to the console, and if not, then we want to log something else. Okay? So in this case, we have, of course, marks, and now the escape string. Then John's. And of course the escaping. All right, let's copy it. And so here it's the other way around. Higher than marks. Okay, so let's quickly recap what we did here. So we're testing if the BMI of Mark is greater than John's. Okay, and so this here, of course, as you already know, will return a true or false value, and that is exactly what we need in an if-else statement. And so in this case, it will then log to the console Mark's BMI is higher than John's. And if it's not, so if this here is false, well then of course John's BMI must be higher than Mark's. And so then that's exactly what we log to the console. All right, and now just to test it out, we say Mark's BMI is higher than John's. Just missing the S, but that doesn't really matter. And just to test the other scenario, let's quickly increase this mass here. And so now John's should be larger. And indeed, so now John's BMI is higher than Mark's. Okay, putting it back. And so now again, Mark's should be higher. And indeed, it is working. And so now you know how to take decisions with code. That's awesome. But this is really just the fundamentals of conditionals and decision taking with code. And so there's a lot more to learn. And so yeah, stay tuned for the next videos. Let's now take conditional to the next level and learn about Boolean logic. And in this small example, we want to log to the console, depending on John's age, if he is a boy, a teenager, a young man or a man. Okay, and so let's start again by defining the first name as John and then the age. And let's start here with 16, for example. All right, so we use our if-else statement, and we can say that if John is younger than 13, well, then he is a boy. All right, so console.log first name plus is a boy. All right, and then we can say else, and let's just copy this line of code here, is a man. Okay, so that covers the boy and the man, but how do we actually decide if he is a teenager or a young man? We need some more options here, right? And we can actually do that with JavaScript. So instead of just having the if and the else block, we can also have an else if block. Okay, so let me show that to you. So here we can have else and then a new if. So let's put it back here. And so here we can put some more text. And actually we need to add a new condition here. And so what do we want to have here? So let's first put in the result here actually, so that we know what we're actually talking about here. So let's say that he is a teenager. And so teenager basically means that he's between 13 and 20, right? So let's write that down here as a comment. Between 13 and 20. Well, how do we write a logical condition to express exactly this? So how do we say that the age should be between 13 and 20? Well, that's kind of difficult, right? So let's think about it a little bit more. So between 13 and 20, what this really means is that the age is greater or equal 13, right? And at the same time, it's also less than 20, right? So again, having an age between 13 and 20 should mean that the age is equal or greater than 13 and less than 20. So these two conditions here at the same time, okay? And so what we need is an operator for this. And so there actually in JavaScript is an AND operator. And in order to learn how that AND operator works, we need to talk about Boolean logic. So in a very broad sense, Boolean logic is a branch of computer science that deals with true and false values. And it's actually something quite important in coding, and so you should make sure to really understand this part. All right? Now, there are several logical operators that deal with true and false values, but the most important ones are the not, and or operators. So let's start by looking at the AND operator. And here we have a table called a truth table, which allows us to see the outcome of the operator. So the AND operator works like this. Suppose that we have two variables a and b. Only if variable a and variable b are both true, the expression a and b will become true, okay? And in all other cases, the result will be false. And that's why it's called the AND operator, because a and b must both be true in order for the result to be true as well. So if either a or b is false, well, then a and b will become false as well. And the same applies if there are more than two variables. Only if all the variables are true, then the AND expression will become true as well. All right, and now the second truth table is for the OR operator. And here things work a bit differently. So with the OR operator, it's enough for one of the variables to be true in order to make a or b come true. And again, that makes sense, right? So it's called the OR operator because only a or b needs to be true in order for the final expression to be true. The result will only be false if both variables are false. And we can see that here in the truth table, right? And once more, it works the same way with multiple variables. So it's enough for one variable to be true to make the final result be true as well if there are like 3, 4, 5, or even 10 Boolean variables. So that's how the AND and true operator works. And then finally, there's also the NOT operator. And this one is really simple. All it does is to invert the true or false value of a variable. So if variable a is true, then not a is false. And if a is false, well, then not a is true. So easy, right? Let's now look at a couple of examples. So we start by defining a variable called age. Then we have age greater or equal than 20, which is of course false because 16 is less than 20. Then we have age less than 30, which of course is true. And finally, we have the not operator. So we know that age less than 30 is true, and we know that the not operator inverts the value. So not age less than 30 is of course false. Makes sense, right? Okay, so the next expression, we already know that the first part, age greater or equal than 20, is false. And we also know that age less than 30 is true. So here we have false and true. So can you guess the result? That's right, it's false, because they're not both true. Okay? Now the next expression is similar, but we have the or operator here. So it's now true or false. So what will the result be this time? All right, now it's true, because with the or operator, it's enough for one of them to be true. So I hope that made sense, and so we can now go back and use what we just learned in code. Okay, and now that we know about the and or operators, we actually have a way of writing out the expression that we need here. So what we want here is the age to be greater or equal to 13, and so the and operator, as you saw before, we write like this. And so we want age greater or equal to 13, and at the same time, the age to be less than 20. Okay, and so that's all we need. That is our expression here, or basically our testing condition. So let's say that the age is 16, so as it is right now. So if we now load this, well, then we log to the console, John is a teenager. And so it's actually working. So right now age is 16, and so age is in fact greater than 13. So this part here is true. Then the age is also less than 20. So this is also true. And so true and true makes true, as we just learned. And so then this block here is executed. Now just quickly talking about the precedence of this operator here, well, it has to be lower than the precedence of these ones here, right? Because of course we first want this to be executed in order to end up with a true or false value, and then this one here. And only after that, we want to combine these true false values using this operator here. And so, of course, the and or operator, they must have a lower precedence than these comparison operators, right? So let's check if that's actually true. And indeed, it is. So the logical and or, they have a lower precedence of 6 and 5 than these comparison, like less than equal, greater, and all these comparison operators here. So they have a higher precedence, and that's why it works the way it works here. Okay? And now just the final step, because we want a boy, teenager, and we also want like a young man between 20 and 30. Okay? So let's create a new else if here. Here the condition, and open a new block. So a young man. And what do we want the age to be now? Well, we want it to be greater or equal than 20, and at the same time, it should be less than 30. Okay? And if we didn't put this equal sign here, well, then the 20 wouldn't be covered anywhere, right? So let's take this out here and go to 20, so set the age to 20, and let's see what happens then. So now it says John is a man. Okay, and that's because this 20 here is not included neither in this condition nor in this one. So here it's just less than 20, and here it's greater than 20, but nowhere is the equal sign. And so that's why we have to include it right here. Okay, we could also have included it here, but well, someone who is 20 years old is not really a teenager anymore, and so we include this equal sign up here. And if we reload it now, well, then it's gonna say young man. Okay, and so that worked just fine. All right, and I think that is enough for this lecture. So you learned all about Boolean logic and the and, or, and not operators, and also that we can add these else-if blocks here to our if-else statements. Okay, so we can have multiple, let's say, if-else statements all in one construct like this. Okay, so make sure that you understand all of this. If necessary, you can maybe review parts of the lecture, and then let's just move on to the next video. In this video, we will look at some more ways of taking decisions with JavaScript. So you've learned about the if-else statement in order to take decisions, but there are more ways of doing this. And so the first thing that we're going to look at is the ternary operator, which is also called the conditional operator. And it is an operator that basically allows us to write like an if-else statement all in one line. Let's take a look at how that works. And again, I'm bringing back my first name variable here. And then we're also going to set the age to 16. And so now let's use the ternary operator in order to log to the console if John drinks a beer or if he drinks juice, depending on his age. Okay, so let's say age greater or equal to 18, which is the legal age at which you could start drinking, at least in Europe, maybe not in the US. Okay, so we start here with the condition, then we use the question mark, and then we write basically what we want to happen if this condition is true. So this is like the if block in an if-else statement. So in this case, we want to log to the console, console.log drinks beer. Okay, so that is the first part. And now we also have to write the else block. Okay, and so for that, we use the colon. And then let's actually go ahead and copy this part here. Drinks juice. Okay, and that's actually it. So this is the ternary operator. And it's called ternary because it has 3 operands. So basically 3 parts that interact with the operator. So we have the condition first, then we have the if block here basically, and then the else block. So let's now test if that works. And indeed, it now says John drinks juice, and that's because he is younger than 18. If you set it to 22, let's say, then it will say John drinks beer. Okay, let's take a look at another example because we can do even better and assign values to variable using the ternary operator in a very simple way. So let's say that we want to define a variable saying what John can drink. So let's say var drink, and now we can use the conditional operator right here. So age greater or equal than 18. Then the question mark, so basically this is to ask a question. So is John greater or equal than 18? And if he is, well, then we can say beer. And if he's not, then we can say juice. And that's it. So basically the result of this entire code here will be beer if the age is greater or equal than 18, and it will be juice if not. And this result will then be assigned to the drink variable. Okay? So again, this is an operator here again, and so an operator always has a result, just like we saw before with any of the other operators. Okay, and so this operator, this ternary operator, is executed, of course, before the assignment operator. Remember, this one is also an operator. And so first we execute this part, which as a result will have either beer or juice, and then that result will be assigned to the drink variable. And so let's log it to the console now, just to make sure that everything is working again. And indeed, it says beer. 14, of course, he will drink juice. Now just to compare what we would have to do without the ternary operator, let's write out the same thing with an if-else statement. So we would have to write, so var drink equals beer in this case, and then the else block, and then here the juice. Okay, so that would be the alternative here of using this. And so what do you think looks better? Well, it's obviously the ternary operator, right? At least I prefer it very much about having to write something like this in case that we want something as simple as just assigning a value to a variable based on a simple condition like this. Okay, so of course you're not going to do a ternary operator for a rather complex decision, but in case that we have something simple like this, well, it is perfect to not have to use an if-else statement like this. So let me comment out this part here just so you know that this is the same. And alright, so we talked about the ternary operator as an alternative way of writing conditionals, but there is actually even more, and that is the switch statement. And this is like a huge if-else statement where we have multiple else-if clauses basically, and so we can replace that with an easier to understand syntax, okay? Now I'm not a big fan of this myself, but you will see it around when you search for like tutorials on the web, and so it's important that you also know the switch statement. So let's add some comments here before we start. So the ternary operator and then the switch statement. All right, so let's define a job here first. And let's say that John is a teacher. And so now we can use this switch statement. Give us some more space here. All right, so we say switch, and then here between these parentheses, we put what we want to test, what we want to evaluate. Okay, and this will make a lot more sense after you see the entire switch statement. So for now, just let's write the job here, and you will then understand why it works like this. So we switch the job basically, and then we can add a couple of case clauses. So we say case, and then we can say, for example, teacher, then the colon, and then in the next line, we say what we want to happen. So in this case, let's say first name teaches kids how to code. So that's what a teacher does, let's say. So again, if the job is equal to teacher, then this code here will be executed. All right, let's add a couple of more. So case driver, let's say, and now I'm just going to grab this piece of code here. Let's say a driver drives an Uber in Lisbon. And so this is the basic functionality of the switch statement. Okay, so we can add a couple of more cases even. So let's say we also want designer, and then again our console.log, let's say designs beautiful websites. All right, so what we're doing here is again to compare the job to each of these different cases. So if the job is teacher, then do this. If the job is driver, then do this. If the job is designer, well, then do this. Now, what we have to do here also is to add a break statement. So in here, we have to say break, because otherwise it will keep evaluating these next cases. Okay, so even if the job is teacher, it will then keep evaluating these other cases. It will keep basically looking at them and see if they are also true. But we don't want that to happen. And so we have to use the break keyword at the end of this block that we want to execute. So break, and here break also. Now, if none of these here applies, we can then add a default. Okay, and so all we have to do is to say default and then define what happens in that case. So in this case, well, let's just say that John does something else. And then here, of course, we don't need to break because it's already the last case here anyway. Okay, so if none of these applies, so these are basically like the else if in the if else statement. So in an if else statement, this would be if job equals teacher, then do this, else if driver, then do this here, else if designer, then do this, and then else do this, right? And so this default here is basically our last else in an if else statement. All right, so let's try it out. And so indeed, it now says that John teaches kids how to code because he is a teacher. Now, if we say that he's a driver, then of course, drives an Uber in Lisbon. Now let's say that he is a cop, and so now none of these applies, and so we should end up with John does something else. Great. Now we can also have multiple case clauses for the same piece of code that we want to execute. So for example, if we want to execute this code here, if the job is a teacher, or also let's say instructor, then we can add simply another case here. So case instructor, and then this piece of code here will also be executed if we say instructor. Just to finish, let's try out that. And yeah, so it still works here as it should. So this is here again a simple way of replacing a huge if-else statement. For example, something like this, where we have this if and then else if, and then else, or it could be even longer. And so sometimes a switch statement looks a bit cleaner than having all of these blocks like this. Okay, and actually, since we're working on it, let's actually go ahead, copy this piece of code and try to replace this if-else statement here with a switch, because that's actually going to work in a slightly different way. And so it's a great opportunity to show you how that could work. So this first switch that I showed you here basically simply switches a variable and compares all of these cases to that variable. But here we have these number ranges, and so it works slightly different. And so it's a great exercise to do this one here as well. So to translate it basically to a switch statement. So in this case, what we want to switch is true. Okay, so we basically want to compare each of the expressions below that we're going to put here in a second to true. And this is a trick to simply make the switch work as an if-else statement with ranges. So our first case will be case age less than 13. And in that case, it will then log this piece to the console, and then don't forget the break. Okay, then the next case is this one, and let's actually go ahead and copy it because we already know how it works at this point. And then log this here to the console so that John is a teenager, and then let's break out of it. So let's complete the code here and then take a closer look at it and see how it works. Okay, so for this case, we want to log this part here to the console, then break out of it. And now finally, we have the else part here. And so for the else part, we are going to use, such as before, the default. So default, and then log that John is a man. All right, and so that's actually it. So we can get rid of this. And so we already translated it here to the switch statement. So we now have all of these conditions here, basically not as strings as we had before. So in this case here, and this is the more usual case of using the switch statement. Okay, so where we have like a string that we want to compare with some variable. In this case here, we have basically these logical expressions here that will turn out to be either true or false. And so for example, if this here turns out to be true, so if the age is between 13 and 20, well, then this here is true and all of the others are false. And remember that we switched true. And so the case that will be true will then be the one that is executed. Okay, so let's try that out. And the age I think is not, actually it is defined as 14. Let's put it again here so we don't have to go up and down to test this. So let's say that he is 10 now. And so let's check it out. So John is a boy. Great. Change it to 17. Now he's a teenager. Now 22 again. A young man. And a man. So all of these now work. So these are two ways of using switch statements, and they can be useful again in case that we have a long if-else statement with lots of else-ifs. So this can look a bit cleaner here. All right, and so that's three ways in which we can write conditional code. So the if-else statement, the ternary operator, and the switch statement. Before we can move on to our next big topic, we need to quickly learn about something called truthy and falsy values. So in JavaScript, a falsy value is a value that is considered false when evaluated in an if-else statement condition. And the values that are falsy in JavaScript are undefined, null, zero, empty strings, and not a number values. So let me actually write that down for you, okay? So falsy values, they are undefined, null, zero, empty strings, and not a number. So we didn't talk about this here yet, but you will see examples of this here later in the course, okay? So all of these 5 different values here will be converted to false when evaluated in a true-false condition, okay? And so that's why we call them falsy. They are not exactly false, but they will turn out to be false when evaluated in a if-else condition. Now we also have truthy values. And of course, the truthy values are all the values that are considered true when evaluated in an if-else statement condition. And so basically, it's all the values that are not falsy. Okay, so let's now take a look at an example to demonstrate how this works. Okay, so let's define a variable of height, let's say, and we will not actually define it. So we just declare it here. And now let's write an if-else statement. So we can say if height, and then log to the console the variable is defined, and else the variable has not been defined. So let's see what happens here. And what we get printed is that the variable has not been defined. And so why is that happening? Well, we declared the variable here as height, but we didn't define it. And so you already know that it's now undefined. And we also know that undefined is a falsy value, right? And so in here, when we say if height, then this height here is converted to false. And so therefore we enter the else block, which will then print that the variable hasn't been defined yet. And so this is a very handy way of testing if a variable has actually been defined or not. Okay, and now let's say that we actually do define a value. So let's say 23. And so watch what happens now. And so, of course, the variable is now defined, okay? And so that's because everything that is not a falsy value is a truthy value. And so we already know that when a variable exists, well, then this here will be converted to true, and therefore the if block here is entered. Okay, so again, a very handy way of testing if a variable actually exists. Now there's just one thing to keep in mind here, and that is that notice how this 0 also is a falsy value. But the height can of course be 0. So let's set it to 0 here, and so the variable is actually defined now, isn't it? So we have a value here, it's not undefined. But if we now reload this, well, then it still says that the variable has not been defined. And so that's of course a situation that we want to avoid. So this here can not only be height, but we also have to say that if the variable is 0, well then the variable is also defined. Okay, and remember that we can use the OR operator to do exactly that. So we already used the AND operator before, but we also talked about the OR operator. And so we can say OR, the height is equal to 0. Okay, and so that will fix the problem. And this is quite a common pattern in JavaScript to check if a variable is defined. So we check if the variable exists or if it is equal to 0. And then the if block here is in fact entered. Okay, so let's check that out again. And so now we see that the variable is defined. Okay, and remember that only one of these here has to be true in order for the entire condition to be true. Okay, so in this case now, the height is 0, and so this here will be converted to false. Okay, but we then have height equal to 0, which is true, of course, because in this situation the height is 0. And so we have false and true, which will result in true. And so therefore this line of code here is then executed. All right, and now this is going to work with any number here and also with strings. So let's say 20, for example. And you see that it's still true because it still entered that first block. But if we have an empty string, remember that also is a falsy value as we see here. So with an empty string, it now says the variable has not been defined again. And so that kind of makes sense, right? Because in fact, there's not really something there. It's just like an empty string, okay? So these are falsy and truthy values and the handy way to check if a variable is actually defined. Now, just to finish, let's talk about the two different equality operators. So we've always used this triple equal operator, right? And this is the one for strict equality comparisons. But there's also the equal equal. So this operator here, and the difference is that this one does type coercion, which means that the data types of both variables do not have to match. Okay, so let me show that to you actually in practice. So just a comment here, and now let's say if height equals 23, so we have a string now here, then let's simply log to the console the equal equal operator does type coercion. Okay, and so let's check out what happens. And before we do that, let's set this here back to 23. Okay, so what we're doing here is to compare the height, which is 23, a number, with the string of 23 with the non-strict equality operator, which is this one. So only two equals. So let's take a look at this. And so you see that this actually turns out to be true. And so we enter this first if block. And so you see the equal equal operator does type coercion. So what this means is that JavaScript, when we use this operator here, converts the string of 23 to a number and then says that it's the same as 23, the number. So let's take a look at that here again. So 23 and then the string 23, and it will say that it is true. Okay, so exactly what we observed in here. So again, JavaScript does type coercion, which basically means to convert the string here to a number and then compares the numbers, and then of course they are the same, right? Now, if instead we use the strict equality operator with the 3 equal signs, well, then it will not do type coercion, and so therefore, what do you think will happen now? Yes, indeed, it now says that it's false, because in fact they are two different things. So we have 23 the number and 23 the string, and they are different things, and so in fact we want them not to be the same. Okay? And so if instead we had the 3 equals here, well then of course we will not see this output here. We will not see this log to the console because it's false. Okay? So that is how the strict equality operator works, and it is absolutely a best practice to always use the triple equal, so the strict equality operator, in order to avoid unexpected situations and bugs. So that's why I've been using this operator all the time with the 3 equals and not just the 2 equals. So after learning all about conditionals and true-false values in JavaScript, it's now time for another coding challenge. So let's say John and Mike both play basketball, but in different teams. And in the latest 3 games, John's team has scored 89, 120, and 103 points. And Mike's team has scored 116, 94, and 123 points. Okay? And what I want you to do is to calculate the average score for each team, then decide which teams wins in average, so the one that has the highest average score, and then print the winner to the console. And when you print that winner to the console, then also include the average score, okay? So we already calculated averages before, so all you have to do is to add up all the values and then divide by 3 in this case, because we have 3 results here, okay? And then what I also want you to do is to change the scores in order to show different winners, okay? And so here, don't forget to take into account that there might be a draw. So it means that there is the same average score. And so in your if-else statement, you will have to keep that in mind, okay? Now, after you finish that, you can take it to the next level and add a little extra. And in this case, Mary also plays basketball, and her team has scored 97, 134, and 105 points. And like before, I want you to log the average winner to the console. So what you're gonna have to do here is to check if one of the players has a larger score than the other 2, okay? And in order to do that, you will probably need the AND operator to take that decision, okay? And if you cannot solve this one, then it's absolutely no problem. You can just watch the solution and see how I do it in there, okay? The most important thing is that you can do these number 1, 2, and 3, okay? Then if you want to take it to the next level here with the number 4, then that's also a great addition to this challenge, okay? So take a couple of minutes here, maybe half an hour, and try to really complete this challenge, and then I'll see you in the next video with the solution. So here goes my solution to coding challenge number 2. So let's start by calculating the average scores. So var score John is equal to, and we have the points, so 89 plus 120 plus 103 divided by 3. Then var score Mike is equal to 116 plus 94 plus 123 divided by 3 again. And now let's simply log these to the console. Score John and score Mike. And here we go. So the average score for John 104 and for Mike 111. So Mike is clearly the winner here. And so let's now log that to the console. Okay, and so what we're going to do here is of course an if-else statement. So give it some space here. And now if score John is greater than score Mike, well, then log to the console that John's, now we need to escape this quote here. So John's team wins with, and now let's also include the score here as I mentioned in the instructions. So score John points. All right, and else if it's the other way around basically, so score Mike is greater than score John, well, then let's of course log that Mike's team wins. Then here we also need to use the score of Mike. Okay, and then else, and that's the situation where there is a draw. So if John's score is not greater than Mike's, and Mike's score is also not greater than John, well then it means that they have the same score. Okay, and so that is here this else block. And so in here we can simply log that there is a draw. So let's test it out. And so yeah, Mike's team wins with 111 points. Let's now increase this here, let's say to 129. And so now probably John wins. And yeah, here we go. So now John's team wins. Now let's try to have a tie here. So we had 89 before. Let's put it to 95. And we need some more points here. So let's increase this to 115. That was a bit too much. 112 maybe. And now we're almost there, I guess. Yeah, so now they have the same scores. So both have 111. And so now we see that there is a draw. And so, of course, none of these situations here apply because John's score is not greater than Mike's score and Mike's score is not greater than John's score. And so, of course, we have a draw. So that is the easier part. Now let's also add Mary to the game. So var score Mary equals, and let's get her points. So 97, 134, and 105. This should be a comma, obviously, and this should be plus signs, of course. Sorry for that. So we add all of them together and then divide it by 3. Also log it to the console just to make sure. So she has 112. And here let's put back what we had initially. So it was, 89. And so now we have these 3 different scores. All right, so let's get rid of this part. And I'm not going to delete it. I'll just comment it out. And okay, so how can John win the game? Basically, he has to have more points than Mike and also more points than Mary, right? And so that's what we have to translate into code now. So an if-else statement, and we have to say that score John should be greater than score Mike, and score John should be greater than score Mary. Okay, and that's it. So, does that make sense? That is a great use case of the AND operator here. And it works like this because we need this here to be true, and at the same time, we need this to be true. So John's score needs to be greater than both Mary's and Mike's. All right, and so only in that case, we will want to print that John's team wins the game. And then from here, it's actually pretty straightforward. So once we understand how the logic works, all we have to do is to do the same for the other players. So how does Mike win the game? Well, of course, he has to have a larger score than the other two. So score Mike needs to be greater than score John. And at the same time, score Mike, and what happened here? So score Mike greater than score Mary. So John, and here we have Mike, and of course score Mike. And then finally, the same for Mary. So score Mary needs to be larger than score John, and score Mary greater than score Mike. And now we say that Mary's teams win, and here the score Mary. All right. Now, what about the other situations? Well, let's just use an else here and say that there is a draw. Okay, so this doesn't really cover all the different situations here, but that's not a big deal. So for this small example, it's okay. Imagine that Mary and John had both the same score, but a larger score than Mike. So they two would have a tie, but would still have more points than Mike. And so that's one of the situations in which we will enter this else block and display that there is a draw. Okay, so these three situations here only work for a clear winner. All right, but again, that's not a big deal. We don't need to cover every single situation here. So these are the more important, of course, where we can define which one is the clear winner. So let's try it out now. And indeed, Mary's team wins with 112 points. Let's add some points here to Mike. And if we add 3 points, then he will have the same score as Mary. So let's put this to 19 here. And they now have both 112. And so we see that there is a draw. So perfect. And if we now increase this even further, let's say 29, well then of course Mike's team has the most point. And now finally let's add some more points here to John just to test if all 3 cases work. And indeed, now he has the most points and he is declared the winner. Great, so that's it. I hope you figured it out. And so now you are really ready to finally move on to the next part of this intro section, which is the hugely important topic of functions. So join me right there in the next video. Welcome back to one of the most fundamental concepts in JavaScript, and that is functions. So if we have a piece of code that we want to run a lot of times, we can put that into a function instead of writing it over and over again, okay? So functions are like containers that hold some lines of code, and we can pass arguments into them, and they can then return us a result. And instead of talking more about this, let me actually show you a very small and very simple example. So this is how we write functions. We simply write function, and then we give the function a name. So just like a variable, we have to give a function also a name. And in this case, what we want to do is to calculate an age. So calculate age. And as I mentioned before, we can pass something called arguments into a function. And so we open up parentheses, and then we say the argument that we want to pass in. And what we want to pass is called birth here. Okay, and so this will kind of be like a variable inside of the function. All right, but more on that a bit later. So we say function, then the name of the function, then the argument that we want to pass into the function, and then finally the curly braces in order to write the function block. So all the code that is in here will be the function block. Now we can of course also pass 0 arguments into this, or we can also pass multiple. So we could pass more like x and y separated by commas like this, but in this case we only want 1 argument, which is the birth here. All right, so we pass in the birth here, and then we can return something from the function. So in this case, what we want to return is the age of the person. So we calculate it by doing 2018 minus the year in which the person was born. And so we can now basically use this variable inside of the function. Okay, so this birth year parameter that we defined here in this function definition up here. So I like to think of a function as like a machine that receives some input, then it does some stuff with it, and finally returns something else. So something new created from the data that we put in. So that is our function definition. Now let's actually go ahead and use this function. Okay, so to call this. So we can say now calculate age, then we open the parentheses, and now is the time where we pass in that argument. So let's say that we want to pass in 1990, and so like this, we will call the function. And the function will then take this value, this 1990, as the birth year. So this is now 1990, and then we will do this calculations, 2018 minus that birth year, so in this case minus 1990, and will then return a result, okay? And so that result, we have to store it somewhere. So let's create a new variable for that, age John. And so in age John here will be stored the result of calling this calculate age function. All right, so test that out and log age John to console. And here we go. So 28 years old. And that makes total sense because it's 2018 minus 1990. So again, we define this parameter here or this argument, and you will hear me saying these two words and they're not exactly the same, okay? But for now, let's just keep it simple and assume that arguments and parameters are the same thing, okay? So we defined this argument here of birth year, And so when we call the function, calculate age down here, and we pass in the value, then this birth year variable here, or